So should you be training with 22 LR? Well, I would tell you that if that question is surfacing, it's probably time to have a serious conversation with yourself about where you think your training is and where you want it to be, because I will tell you there is no definitive answer. All right, well, we're gonna get to the bottom of that today, and we're gonna help you guys figure out if that's something you should be doing or something you should be avoiding. All right, guys, and this all being said, this is gonna be a very lengthy video because we're diving kind of into the weeds on this. Feel free to skip around to all the portions that we have separated for the video if some of this bores you. One thing I wanted to hop into is a little bit about me. I know I'm relatively new to the channel. You guys have probably seen me pop up in a handful of videos, handful of reels and shorts. So first and foremost, my full-time job is here at Herrington Arms. I am our account executive in charge of sales. So anything that has to do with sales, whether it's dealer or customer related. So going a little bit of my background, I spent 6 years in the Army National Guard as a 12B combat engineer. Shout out to my dudes in the 812. The last 4 to 5 years, I've also been an active police officer working in patrol. The last 5 to 6 years, I've also been a firearms instructor in the private sector. I've been traveling the country teaching classes and taking classes. I work for Defender Series Training Group, where I'm the lead firearms instructor. I work with an assortment of other teammates of mine who are also law enforcement and on SWAT. Dudes I work with are great. Wouldn't trade it for the world. This all being said, like my background, whether I'm a cop, military, whatever, none of it matters. What matters is my ability to communicate useful information to you that you can take home and make yourself a better shooter and or at least understand the sport of shooting a little bit better. All right, so jumping into the fun stuff here. 2 guns we use, obviously one a rifle platform, one a pistol platform. The one we used for a pistol was the Glock 44. For those of you that are not familiar with this is basically a Glock 19 that's chambered in 22. The mags are almost the same size. The grip is definitely the same size. The attachment to where you would put a light is literally the same thing. I would say the only thing that's largely different about this gun versus like its 9mm or 40 cal clone is the slide. The slide on this is kind of like plastic or polymer, and you cannot mount an optic to this. For the rifle, I went with an M&P 1522. There is a little bit of history behind this gun. I bought this and built it out pretty much at the height of COVID. If you guys remember, like ammo 5.56 was roughly pushing $1 around. And I thought like, hey, I'll build a 22 cloner or 22 trainer, and this will save me a bunch of money while I still get to carve out my skill set. Spoiler, I used it once. Turns out I didn't end up using this as much as I thought I would, and we'll kind of get into that later in the meat of the video. But just kind of like a breakdown of what this gun is. At its core, it's an M&P 1522. I believe it's the older model because everything is pretty much polymer on this gun, including the rail. Also has the quad rail on it, which is just aesthetically pleasing in my opinion. MOE stock, MOE grip, mag pull sights. I have like an Amazon / Unity ripoff here on the bottom of the Aimpoint Pro optic, and I have like again like an Amazon laser up front, and I just run a Surefire 1500 lumen on the front and then a BCM grip. These were spare parts I had laying around from other builds, so I just threw them on this gun because they were laying around. Diving into like the history of 22 and how it's been used in training and such, it actually goes back farther than most people are aware of. Early 1900s, like even evidence of like the late 1800s. The idea of using a lesser caliber for training has been a philosophy of use for generations. So though the history of this is very vast, what we're gonna start with is World War I, where the United States Army introduced the M1922. This was kind of like the 22 conversion, or like 22 comparable to the M1903 Springfield. And then for those of you who don't know, the 1903 was chambered in 30-06, so definitely a hefty boy caliber, and then now jumping all the way back to 22. So this also carried its way into World War II, where the military used it for the 1911, the M1 carbine, the M1 Grand, and I think a handful of other guns to use as trainers. This was also due to like the budget at the time of World War II. Obviously, like we didn't have a ton of money to throw around. Having troops shoot 45 cal and 30-06 all day probably wasn't the best for the accounting department of the Army at the time. So having a 22 LR for familiarity, for training, especially carving out marksmanship skills, was probably a very important thing for them to have. Now, like, let's fast forward to like modern day, you know, early GWAT, late 90s, early 2000s. We kind of saw the Army doing this again with the M16 platform, the N4 platform, and the M9. This isn't super common, but if you talk to some early GWAT guys, they'll tell you that they actually use 22 conversions for a lot of these platforms. So now kind of like hopping into the more civilian side of things, we saw like in the early 2000s, HK, Colt, Smith & Wesson, a lot of these companies making 22 LR conversions or 22 LR clones of the rifles. Like right off the top of my head, I can tell you like Colt made a 22 LR M4 clone that was pretty much like even full metal and everything like that. It was a pretty one-for-one scale clone. Keeping ourselves in that same historical realm, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, using a lesser caliber to train wasn't always a super uncommon thing. It wasn't just always like main caliber, then 22. We historically saw, especially in the 80s and 90s when the 1911 was kind of in its full realm and full reign, a lot of people were shooting 9mm 1911s versus their 45 alternative. This is mostly just due to budgeting reasons and keeping familiarity with the gun. We're merely just glancing over the history of this. Forgotten Weapons does very in-depth videos and a very in-depth dive into historical relevance of 22LR and the 22LR conversions, clones, whatever it is you want to word it as. He dives into the serious Nat's ass detail of it. I highly suggest checking out his channel. So now, like, hopping into more modern times, we kind of see the PCC taking like its reign in full force, whether it's a PCC that looks exactly like an M4 or M16 clone, or a PCC like an MP5, or something that like a Chris Vector or B&T might make. We see a lot of people going back to these platforms for budgeting reasons, especially because 5.56 is 50 cents a round, 45 cents a round. It's a lot of money per trigger press. I've also kind of seen this, not entirely common, but somewhat commonly in the long range world. I've seen people, because 6.5 Creedmoor, 308, when you're shooting those calibers in match ammo, I mean, you're looking at least $1 a round. Most of those are like $1.50, sometimes even $2 a round. There are people using like 223 equivalents to the rifles they're running in 6.5 or 308 as kind of like trainers. That way they're still getting the reps of utilizing dope and practicing those marksmanship skills that are very essential behind a bolt action or precision platform. All right, so now that we've kind of like conquered the historical portion of this, let's kind of hop into the pros of shooting 22. The biggest thing that sticks out to me when we're talking about pros of 22, I would say if you're trying to like get kids into shooting or people who are newer to shooting into shooting, 22 is great because it's not scaring people every time they pull the trigger. It's not an aggressive bang. There is literally no recoil. It's easy to bite off for a newer person or a child.
All right, guys, so the platform we're using today is a Glock 44. This is literally a Glock 19 chambered in 22. It has even like the same thickness and feel to a Glock 19 mag, but it only holds 10 rounds. I did throw my Surefire X300 on this just so it kind of fits better in the holster. That being said, if you don't have one of these, it will still go in there and lock, surprisingly enough. But if we're trying to get like better reps, this is about where a full-size gun would stick out of this holster for me, so it actually makes sense throwing the light on there. All right, so first and foremost, this gun is just an absolute hoot to shoot. This would be a great platform for somebody who's new to shooting. If I was on the range with somebody who's never pulled a trigger before, the first thing I'd be pulling out is a 22 handgun or 22 rifle. For this, I feel like that fits an excellent role. Outside of that, like testing hard skills and actually trying to elevate your shooting, this is obviously not the platform to do it. But I honestly do not believe that is the intent of this platform. This would also be an absolute hoot to suppress. So for me, this is very fun in terms of like, let's just say, elevating your skill level or serious training. This isn't it.
You kind of see this like with Boy Scouts. They commonly use 22LR to familiarize kids with shooting. I would say a large portion of the reason why 22LR is brought up when it comes to training and shooting is because, well, it's budget friendly. Okay, when I first got into shooting, I was a broke-ass sheriff's deputy making $17 an hour. I was definitely tight on a budget, and I was most certainly tight on time. So I understand using 22LR as a budget trainer. There's an advantage to this, right? Like, you're at least getting reps, okay? So you're going to the range, getting reps, getting exercise, whatever it is. You're also getting ideally familiar with a platform that you're familiar with, whether it's an M4 type of platform or a Glock platform like this one. And also depending on how you feel about shooting, it's also just super fun. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, and you guys will see like in these clips that they're probably showing for B-roll, I'm just like whipping these guns around because they weigh nothing. There is no recoil. So in terms of like fun level, definitely 1,000 for sure. And honestly speaking, that's kind of the reason why I've held on to this gun for so long, is for budgeting reasons and because it's super fun to shoot. I think it's also a very essential caliber for you guys that are into hunting or like the survival mindset. You can walk into a Walmart and find 22LR. It's very low budget, very low cost, great for hunting small game, and it's inherently very quiet even with the suppressor. If you guys kind of want to see like like an in-depth dive into 22LR and its hunting and prepper purposes, I would suggest checking out Dirty Civilian. They did a great video that went into an entire deep dive of the lethality of 22 and where it's useful in our lives. So the other thing that's been great about 22LR is the advancement in technology we've had around it. You can now buy conversion kits. The one I most commonly see is the one from CMMG. They actually make a kit that places your bolt carrier out in your AR-15, so you just take the guts out, throw theirs in. They make a mag that'll fit in a normal lower, and obviously it feeds 22LR. And you can get great training reps with your main squeezable rifle and obviously train on a low budget. And now hopping into the more controversial side of things, the cons of shooting 22. I think this is a very important point to kind of circle back to what was asked, the question that was asked at the beginning of this video about where your skill sets are and where you want them to be. I feel like that's gonna be a very good indication of how you're gonna feel about this conversation going forward. So I also feel like it's pretty safe to say that if you're trying to excel to a higher level of shooting, you're going to find that guns like this are going to start collecting dust in terms of like training value. And you're going to start finding, especially if you're like training on a relatively serious level, that in order to get good with the firearm that you want to get good with, well, you have to use that firearm. You know, I feel like a good correlation of this is kind of like F1 drivers or guys who drive around race cars for a living. You don't see those guys whipping around in golf carts for practice, okay? They're typically using the real thing, or they're utilizing $30,000 training simulators in order to do that. You know, the other thing I kind of want to just squash off the rip here, which I know is a concern with people why they jump to 22LR trainers and stuff, is budget. Okay, and I will tell you this, if you want to achieve a higher level of shooting, you're going to have to understand that it's going to, one, take a serious time commitment, and two, take a serious budget commitment. Okay, and I can tell you, working 5 jobs and one of them at one point in time being very low paying, there is nobody that understands, you know, those commitments being challenged more than me. I feel like this kind of carries on with anything in life. The better you want to be at something, the more time it's going to take you and the more it's going to cost you, because the more and more serious you're going to get with it. So the other thing I think is really important to bring up too is being fundamentally underdeveloped if you're using 22LR too much. We're not completely knocking on using 22LR for training, but for those of you that may be using it too much, you have to be extremely self-conscious of where it's going to fundamentally underdevelop you, in the specifics of which fundamental it's going to be underdeveloping you. You know, like right off the top of my head, I can tell you right now, grip is gonna be a huge one to surpass. If you're used to gripping a gun that's giving you 22LR feedback, so chances are the input you're putting into a platform like that is going to be nowhere near its full-size alternative, like just using an example, like a 9mm. If you're using a 22LR for training, you're gonna have to be extremely conscious of the fact that your grip is repeatable every single time and it's durable, okay? And this is actually a common mistake I see with people dry firing. People aren't always building the firing grip they would use in like let's just say a live fire training session versus what they are building when they dry fire. That is something you have to be super conscious of. It's a mistake that almost everybody makes, and it's super easy to forget about because you're just trying to get reps in. Your gun's not firing, so it's very easy to forget about the input and grip pressures you need to put into a gun when you're not shooting it. So you'll also find that there's going to be a handful of other fundamentals and shooting skills is going to underdevelop you on. So I think it's safe to say that like if you're definitely trying to hit a higher level of shooting, you might be setting yourself up for failure if you're training with 22 too much. Another important question I think you're going to have to ask when we're talking about the cons of 22 is your time investment. For me personally, I have to drive 35, 40 minutes out to the range, and I need to get ROI on my shooting because I have 5 other jobs pulling me in 5 other different directions. Let's not forget the fact that there's also a budget playing into this as well. If you're taking the time to go to the range, I really think it would be more beneficial for you to use the platform that you want to be good with, not one that's just necessarily used to like get you familiar with, especially if you're like at an appropriate point in your shooting journey. I also think you're gonna realize, especially if you're taking shooting seriously and elevating your skill sets, you're gonna come to find that 22, like using 22 to train is really just spicy dry fire. Like the only difference between 22 and dry fire at this point for me is one's putting holes in paper and the other's not. I can still work all the things I need to when I'm dry firing, whether it's draws, reloads, target transitions, efficiency and speed behind the fundamentals, movement. I mean, there is an insane amount of dry fire programs that are now out who I would say are very beneficial. Off the top of my head, Joe Farewell is a huge dry fire guy. He's hot behind a gun. And he also has dry fire programs that people can follow. And this is kind of like where I'm, again, reiterating back to that first question that I asked. Like, my goal is to get good with the 9mm platform that I'm using. So it would be diminishing returns for me and would make 0 sense to use anything but that gun or that platform. I also think like the reality of this is if 22 was really that great of a trainer or that great of an alternative, I would say you would definitely see more competition shooters moving towards it because those guys, especially when they're taking it serious, are putting thousands and thousands of dollars towards 9 mil, 40, 45, whatever it is. And then let's not forget the amount of time they're consuming, whether it's dry fire or time at the range. And I think we would also see a lot of tier 1 operators moving towards like a 22 LR platform if there was actually that much benefit in training with it. But we're not. And that's just the harsh reality of this. So if we're gonna pull from professionals, I would say this is a safe thing to pull from. I reached out to a handful of people about this topic just to make sure I wasn't approaching it from a narrow mindset or like a fair perspective. One of the first people I reached out to was somebody I took a class with midsummer, was Nick with Velox Training Group. Pretty much aligned with everything we just stated previously. He said that he basically reiterated the fact that once you hit a certain point with your shooting, dry fire is gonna be the way to go because it's keeping you familiar with the platforms that you want to be good with. I also reached out to one of my buddies in the long range industry. He's been an instructor for a very long time, has a lot of time behind teaching behind a long range platform and a lot of time shooting a long range platform. His name's Ryan DiAugustino with Emissary Consulting. So when I reached out to him, his thoughts were pretty much along the same aspects. If you want to get good on a platform, you have to use that platform. He did mention like the fact that there are 22 leagues that exist out there, whether it's long range or just marksmanship. And that's honestly, I would say, a little bit different than what we're talking about here today. I just kind of want to reiterate too, as I know it might sound like we're just completely dogging on it. I promise you we're not. I really just wanted to start the conversation because, as you guys saw earlier in the video, I made the mistake of buying and completely tricking out a 22 trainer. And then when I went to the range, I was like, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. And I would say a lot of shooting correlates with life, and both are the same in the fact that you're going to learn from your mistakes, okay? And a large mistake of mine was thinking that 22 LR could be a large portion of my training. Just touching back on what we said earlier, like if you're just trying to maintain your marksmanship skills and maintain familiarity with a platform and you don't have the budget to spend on 9mm and 5.56, like it's not cheap to shoot this stuff, especially on a daily basis or weekly basis. It's also a giant time constraint. So like I completely understand why people would be going back to it. Not everything applies to the mindset and where I'm coming from with this. I just truly believe, based off my training experience and my failures, that if you are trying to excel in shooting and elevate your shooting skills and skill sets and really start pushing fundamentals and speed, you're gonna find that you're gonna need to use the platform that you want to get good with.
All right. So, initial thoughts. I would say in terms of like grip sights and trigger, let's just talk sights and trigger real quick. Trigger is definitely different from a full-size Glock, 100%. Feels different, breaks different. Grip, I can tell I'm cheating a little bit and adapting my grip to more of a 22 pistol than like, let's just say a 9mm handgun. Sights and vision. We're running iron sights on this gun, so different than what I'm used to. I normally run like a red dot setup. That being said, I would say the only value I'm seeing for me personally right now, where I'm at in my shooting journey, is pushing vision with 22. Outside of that, I don't think this really provides much value for me in terms of like training what I would call hard skills, especially when it comes to grip sights and trigger. I don't think this is doing much. Grip is, you guys have heard me in previous videos, definitely one of those things I emphasis on, and 22 is definitely not doing for me in that field. So overall, not bad. All right, so first and foremost, that was fun as hell, okay? That being said, I will say in terms of like grip and mounting the gun, I can see where that would be a problem with a platform like this because it has no recoil and there is no feedback. Like I hardly have to put any input in this gun to get it to behave the way I want it to. And I think in terms of like looking down the road, that's gonna be a problem because the hardest thing about shooting rifle is the whole gripping portion and body to rifle connection. So you're definitely gonna be shorting yourself long-term with a gun like this. Great for starters, great for, you know, introductions and stuff, but if you're really trying to elevate your shooting, I think this will probably hinder you over time, and you will find that this will probably start collecting dust on the shelf.
Now I think it's like a good point to touch on exceptions to the rule, and first and foremost of them being PCCs. I think PCCs are a great exception to this rule, mostly due to recoil mitigation reasons and grip reasons. I think if we're talking a rifle-based platform, you guys have probably seen me in reiterate in other videos about grip. I think that that is one of the hardest things about shooting rifle, is understanding the body to rifle connection with rifle and understanding how to grip it properly so this thing isn't just completely beating you up. That being said, 9mm or a PCC type like this, whether it's an AR-15 clone chambered in 9mm or an MP5 or a B&T or whatever it is, I think are good trainers because it's at least giving you the familiarity of the same grip you would hold with a full-size rifle or like a rifle chambered in, let's just say 5.56, a modern rifle. The recoil, depending on what kind of gas system and recoil system is used in it, most 9mm, it's obviously not this one, but most 9mm platforms that are similar to an AR-15 are blowback operated, and those are pretty brutal in the recoil world, okay? And now, especially with the advancement of technology, you are able to buy a 9mm upper for, let's say, an AR-15 like this. I can't remember the name of the company off my head, but basically I've seen a handful of people now building clones of like their 5.56 rifle and making like a 9mm clone of it. All I have to do is replace this upper with a 9mm upper. I can still use the same rail. Obviously the barrel's gonna have to be different. I'm gonna have to change out the recoil spring and recoil buffer weights and stuff like that. But I'm able to keep this lower as well. And I can't remember the name of the company, but they make 9mm PMAG inserts for PMAGs. And I can use this same lower, throw my 9mm PMAG in there, and go to town with my 9mm upper. I think that's a pretty good exception to the rule. One, because you're still testing your fundamentals. It's not like 22 where there is no recoil. With 22, you guys will see in the videos, I definitely, or our range videos, I definitely mention how you can get away with murder when it comes to the mount of a rifle or even just the grip of the rifle. With a platform like this, chambered in 9mm, I don't think you're going to be able to. You're definitely going to see the response of that a lot more as well. PCCs are kind of becoming all the rage. And I think for good reasons, obviously because there's PCC divisions in competition and, well, they're good alternatives. Like, is it cheaper than 22? No, but it's at least cheaper than 5.56. So I think it's better to expend 23 to 26 cents a round versus maybe 45 or 50 cents a round. All right, so in conclusion, I can say with 100% confidence that if I were to use 22 LR for my training, I would not be where I am in my journey. I would be nowhere close to it. A few months ago, I heard Modern Samurai kind of coin the term surplus of skill, and that kind of like bounced off me in a good way. The surplus of skill I've been able to achieve was definitely not due to 22 training. It was due to training with the firearms that I want to get good at. For where I'm at in my journey, 22 offers me no, in terms of a training platform, offers me no serious edge over dry fire. Like I said, kind of in the pros portion of this, it's 100% for me, spicy dry fire. Like the only thing that's different between that and dry fire is I'm seeing holes in paper. Like that's the only thing that's different. So if we're going back to the original question in this video, is 22 LR good for training? For me, no, it's not. But this all being said, this is all my opinion, and my opinion is derived from my experience. And this also is derived from the journey of shooting that I decided to go down. As I stated earlier in the video, not everybody's in the same journey or in the same mindset when it comes to shooting, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you're trying to take shooting seriously, utilizing 22 LR as a trainer is just gonna be a hindrance for you. And I think you're gonna find that out relatively quickly, especially depending on how hard you wanna push yourself for this sport. This all being said, now that we're at the end of the video, I want this to be a discussion or a conversation. This is not, like I said earlier, us just completely crapping on 22. I want you guys to give us your opinions. I want you guys to give us your thoughts because everybody's had a different experience when it comes to training. Everybody brings different skill sets to the table. I would love for you to share what yours are. If you guys liked the video, please like and subscribe for next time.